Welcome. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome to our first National Archives Know Your Records program since March. My name is Andrea Matney, coordinator for the Know Your Records program. Thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to be back in live broadcasting, so please excuse any technical issues as this is our first live broadcast with the new system. But we chose to live broadcast so you can ask questions of the presenter, Daniel Dancis, and chat with our audience members. Here's how to participate. First, log into YouTube and then type into the chat section. From there, we will address your questions for the presenter at the end of his talk. Also, I'd like to point out under the Show More, you will find links to the presentation slides, a handout, live captioning, and the events evaluation form. The goal of the Know Your Records program is to provide you with educational resources on how to access and do research using U.S. federal government records. Please allow me to do a quick introduction of the wonderful behind-the-scenes staff. Today's YouTube chat moderator is Amber Forrester. Our audiovisual manager is Jamie Atkinson, and our captioning transcriber is Terry O'Connor. Without further ado, today's program is entitled Researching World War II Spanish Posters at the National Archives by Daniel Dancis. Daniel Dancis began working at the National Archives in 2006 as a contractor on the Iraqi Jewish Archive Project. From 2007 to 2012, he served as a conservation technician in the Document Conservation Labs in Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland. In 2012, he joined the Textual Records Division in College Park, where he completed the Archivist Development Program. As an archivist, he has processed material that includes records of donated polar collections, the Office of Alien Property, the Africa Middle East Theater of Operations from World War II Army, the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Public Affairs, and the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities. Daniel also serves as a manager and blogger at the Text Message blog. Please welcome our presenter, Daniel Dancis.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. Hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Andrea and the entire team behind the scenes for helping put this together, and to thank you in the audience for attending wherever you might be. I want to start by recognizing that this month we celebrate Hispanic American Heritage Month. The National Archives has 2 dedicated web pages. Please check them out at archives.gov. Next slide, please. So it really is my great pleasure to present to you on this topic today. We have a lot of great material and a lot to cover. Without further ado, let us begin talking about World War II Spanish language posters at the National Archives. Next slide, please. On this slide, we see a group of 4 posters that we will look at today and the names of the artists who made them. From left to right, they are Antonio Arias Bernal, Alfonso Ontiveros, Leon Alguera, and Javier Gonzalez. These 4 artists all have ties to Mexico, and all 4 were active when the US government carried out propaganda activities in the 1940s during the Second World War. Among these activities were efforts by 2 US government agencies to appeal to Spanish speakers. Included among the varied activities they carried out was the commissioning of posters, including the ones we see on this slide. Today, I will share with you documents that can only be found at the National Archives that tell some of the stories behind these posters. My goal is to provide an introduction to a group of fascinating posters and the artists who made them, to explain the context in which they were made, and overall to share my enthusiasm for this topic and the research process, while also getting to show you some pretty cool and colorful posters. As we go through this presentation, think about posters with a few questions in mind. Why was the poster created, and by whom? Who was it intended for? Did it reach them? And do the posters raise any further questions? We will see these posters again, so now is a good time to move on to the next slide. The presentation will be in 3 parts. After a quick introduction to the National Archives, we will begin with our main topic. We will discuss the background and lead up to World War II in relation to the US and Latin America, learn about the two agencies that I mentioned, and the documents that shed light on the posters and the artists who made them. Finally, we will wrap up with a few suggestions for conducting poster research yourself. On the right of this slide, we have one of our poster examples. This colorful image is composed almost entirely of Spanish text and is by the artist Herbert Bayer. It's entitled Libres, or the Four Freedoms, which was a popular theme at this time. We won't look at this poster specifically any further, but it is an example of one of the posters made by the agencies that we will learn more about today. Next slide, please. Only 1% to 3% of records created by the federal government are so important they are kept forever. It is the mission of NARA to protect these records, preserve them, and provide public access to them. So where does this happen? Well, NARA has 14 public research facilities and 14 presidential libraries, and you can browse descriptions of our holdings in the online National Archives catalog. For the most part, the records that I will discuss today are located at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, which is where I work, just outside Washington, D.C. At NARA in College Park, the records are assigned to custodial units based on their format. Paper-based written documents are assigned to the Textual Records branch, while posters, photographs, and other graphic materials are assigned to the Still Pictures branch. Since I work in the Textual Records branch, I will be speaking about posters from the perspective of the Textual Records holdings, that is, paper documents. With that said, we can now delve into our topic. Next slide, please. Before getting to the Second World War, we want to take a look at the nature of the US-Latin American relationship. And to do so, we begin well before the war. Next slide, please. Just after winning the 1928 election, President-elect Herbert Hoover embarked on a goodwill tour to Latin America. His purpose was to establish good neighbor relations between the US and its neighbors to the south. Following him as president, Franklin D. Roosevelt advanced this goal and spoke about it in his first inauguration speech. From this, we have what would become known as FDR's Good Neighbor Policy, in which President Roosevelt was indicating, in a break from the past, that the US would not interfere in the affairs of Latin American countries. By the 1940s, the policy not only included non-intervention, but also encompassed trade and cooperation. And as we shall see, the policy also came to be associated with solidarity between the people and nations of the Western Hemisphere. And the phrase good neighbor was invoked often. The concepts that the policy represented set the stage for the US relationship with its neighbors to the south. Next slide, please. The importance of Latin America to the US during World War II was first and foremost about proximity. After all, the US is part of the Western Hemisphere, and these are neighboring countries. So it was of utmost importance for the US to have allies in its own backyard and to keep the Axis countries from establishing or even strengthening footholds and friends in the region. The resource-rich countries of Latin America were also vital to the US commercially, and the resources, including metals, oil, and rubber, were vitally important for war production. Equally important was to deny these resources to the Axis enemy. There was also a guest worker program that the US benefited from, known as the Bracero program. It brought Mexican laborers to the US to fill labor shortages during the war, and lasted until 1964. The importance of the resources, the commerce, and keeping travel and trade routes open is expressed in the poster on the right, which was put out by transportation and shipping companies, including Pan Am and the United Fruit Company. The excerpt from the poster shows the names of the companies, includes a reference to the Good Neighbor Policy, and invokes hemispheric unity. This is a good moment for a reminder. If you want to see anything up close, the presentation slides are available on YouTube, on the YouTube page, where you can open them as a PDF. This poster, for example, is dotted with wonderful little illustrations that would be a shame to miss. Often the Pacific Ocean is Poseidon with his trident and either a mermaid or a siren beside him. And as an additional just side note, the image on this slide is a poster in the collection of the National Archives. As mentioned, it is a commercial poster, not a US government poster. This is not unusual. Many private companies participated in campaigns in support of the war, and some of what they made found its way to government agencies, eventually ending up in the collections at the National Archives. However, not to go too off track, today we will be sticking to US government commissioned posters. And one last important note before we move on. In the realm of the arts, there was a strong North-South connection. Since the early 1920s, American artists had been strongly influenced by the art and artists of Mexico, with many traveling south to see the work of the great Mexican artists and to meet them. In the 1930s, the leading Mexican muralists, Orozco, Diego Rivera, and Siqueiros, spent considerable time in the United States. Thus, we see that the US was tied to Latin America, and especially Mexico, not only by proximity and commercial interests, but also by way of the arts. Next slide, please. We will now take a look at the first of the two major wartime agencies that commissioned Spanish language posters, this being the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So, the CIAA was America's civilian wartime agency responsible for Latin American affairs. Was responsible for Latin American affairs. On the right, we see various newspaper headlines from 1939 to 1941 attesting to Nazi Germany's robust propaganda campaigns in Latin America prior to the US entering the war. In response to this, a special federal government agency was created in 1940. This is what would become known as the CIAA. Its goal was to strengthen ties between the US and Latin America in order to counter Axis influence and secure hemispheric solidarity. The agency was directed by Nelson Rockefeller for the duration of the war. Rockefeller was an heir to the Standard Oil Company and a patron of the arts with a strong affinity for Latin America. Later, he would serve as the governor of the state of New York and then as Gerald Ford's vice president. Under him, the agency produced information programs in radio, film, press, and print, and coordinated international art exhibits and cultural exchanges. Walt Disney made the animated Saludos Amigos based on an agency-funded tour to Latin America. You can find clips on YouTube and listen to its catchy music. Orson Welles also traveled to Latin America as an agency goodwill ambassador in order to make a documentary, though it was never completed. And among all of these activities, there was also the making of posters. Next slide, please. The first of our poster artists that we will look at today is Antonio Arias Bernal. On this slide, we see a poster that he made for the CIAA. In the poster, we see a colossal figure armed with a rifle and bayonet, standing guard with feet firmly rooted equally in North and South America, and the slogan, Como un solo hombre, as one man. The message here is clear. The countries of the Western Hemisphere stand as one, united against their enemies. This image stands out from his more familiar cartoon style, which, as we shall see in his remaining posters. The posters Arias Bernal made were the result of a CIAA-funded project that brought him to the States as a visiting artist in the fall of 1942. His trip was a public relations success and was reported on by the New York Times at the time. And as it happens, there's a treasure trove of documents that recounts his trip. Next slide, please. In the records of the U.S. Embassy, Mexico City, under a file appropriately titled Propaganda Project, are 25 pages devoted to Arias Bernal's trip to Washington. The files consist of correspondence between various staffers at the embassy in Mexico City, CIAA officials, and the State Department, who together planned and coordinated Arias Bernal's trip. Everything from vetting his anti-access credentials up to the details about furnishing him with desk, chair, and art supplies. The correspondence paints a colorful picture of the workings of state at this time and gives us a look at Arias Bernal from the perspective of his American handlers. The link on this slide will take you to the digitized file in the National Archives catalog, where you can peruse the 25 pages at your leisure. The file has a number of great tidbits. We'll take a look at a few alongside the posters that resulted from this trip to give you a small taste. Next slide, please. Here we have one of Arias Bernal's posters, done in his signature cartoon style. We see a large figure in a yellow sombrero rolling up his sleeves as he is about to sock it to a parade of startled Nazis led by a cartoon Adolf Hitler. You may notice that there is no written caption on this poster. Posters without text appear on occasion. It's not uncommon. And in the documents, they often talk about posters being an effective means of communication, especially for illiterate individuals. Arias Bernal says as much in the New York Times article. Nonetheless, the small print at the bottom of the poster is in Spanish, leaving little doubt that this is intended for a Spanish-speaking audience. On the right, we have one of the pages from the embassy correspondence, and I couldn't resist placing this quote from it alongside this poster. Next slide, please. Here we have another page from the file. This one includes a reference to his wife at the time. According to the file, they had recently wed. Unfortunately, she is only referred to as Mrs. Arias Bernal, and we never learn her name from the correspondence. In spite of this limitation, we get a glowing description of her as seen in the quote. I include this page in order to give her credit and the representation that she deserves. Searching online, I was unable to confirm her identity any further, but I have no doubt that a researcher in Mexico could find out more about her. Next slide, please. Here we see the remainder of Arias Bernal's posters printed by the CIAA. On the left, we see an image depicting Adolf Hitler about to have an unpleasant encounter with a cactus as Uncle Sam and his Mexican counterpart look on. Uncle Sam appears in a number of Arias Bernal magazine covers at this time. In the center image, we see the Axis leaders impaled by a large V for victory, and on the right, we once again see the three cartoon dictators as they look up in awe at the combined industrial strength of the US and Latin America. The slogan in English says, "Union is strength." There also exists a version of this poster in Portuguese. Next slide, please. Here we have examples from the holdings of NARA's Still Pictures branch of additional illustrations by Arias Bernal. These are original artworks, not posters. Upon first seeing these, I assumed they were rejects. Upon first seeing these, I assumed they were rejects. This was based on the very simple fact that I had never seen versions of these as printed posters. It wasn't conclusive, but simply based on the information that I had at the time. However, this was later confirmed. Next slide, please. And here is the confirmation. On this slide, on the left, we see a cover letter from Frida Everett at the CIAA addressed to Jack Dunlaney at the Office of War Information. The letter and its attachments provide an inventory and description of the posters made by the CIAA as of the date of the letter. This confirms which and how many posters Arias Bernal made. It also provides exclusive information about the poster on the right. Obviously, with the cartoonish look and subject matter, this looks very similar to an Arias Bernal poster and could easily be confused for an Arias Bernal poster. But the signature says Ontiveros. Prior to this letter, I had not seen any mention of Ontiveros in the files or found any success searching under that name on the internet, beyond discovering more copies of this poster. I did not know his first name or anything else about him. Here, for the first time, he is identified as Alfonso Ontiveros, a Mexican artist. Next slide, please. So this is the two-page attachment listing the posters with their descriptions and artists. This document and the folder it comes from have potential to be very useful for additional identification of posters. The descriptions on these 2 pages include commentary about the posters, such as one of our most effective posters, very popular, popular, extremely effective, and so popular, a successor is now in preparation. Next slide, please. Next, yep, that's good. So here we have a few of the Spanish posters from Everett's letter. There are also versions of some of these in Portuguese, French, and English. These are all posters commissioned by the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, all made for Latin America. The link on this page will take you to the images in the National Archives catalog. Not all of the posters from Everett's inventory are found in the catalog. So on the YouTube page, there's a PDF that you can open with links to the remainder of the posters listed in Everett's letter, which some of them can be found in other institutions. This brings us to the end of the discussion about the CIAA's posters for Latin America, and we will now turn our attention to the main US agency responsible for overall propaganda and wartime posters. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Office of War Information was established to create a coordinated government war information program, both foreign and domestic. If you're familiar with World War II propaganda, the OWI probably had a hand in it, such as some of the programs listed on the graphic on the right. Conserve food, plant a victory garden, observe ceiling prices, and the rest. The OWI got the word out through various media, including, of course, posters, and worked with other government agencies, including the CIAA. However, the order that established the OWI stipulated that Latin America was not in its purview. Latin America would remain the responsibility of the CIAA. Nonetheless, the OWI did make propaganda material in Spanish, as we shall see. Next slide, please. Beginning in the spring of 1942, the OWI's foreign language section devoted attention to the population of Spanish speakers in the southwestern United States, from Texas to California. In the records, this group is variously called Spanish Americans, American Mexicans, or persons of Mexican Spanish descent. As the OWI saw things, there was a need to educate this demographic about the war effort. There was a feeling in Washington that this demographic wasn't informed about the war, was susceptible to fascist influence from south of the border, and was largely illiterate and not fluent in English. In written reports from May 1942, like the one on this slide, plans are made for an information campaign directed at this population. At the bottom of this slide, we see some general themes emerge, including a call for informational posters in the Spanish language on selective service, civilian defense, farming, etc. The foreign language section would soon devote even more time to the Southwest due to events in Los Angeles that occurred in the late summer and fall of 1942. Next slide, please. On the night of August 1st, 1942, 22-year-old Jose Diaz was murdered at a birthday party near a popular swimming hole known as the Sleepy Lagoon in Los Angeles, California. He was an innocent victim of gang violence. Responding to the murder, authorities clamped down and rounded up over 600 young people, mostly Mexican Americans known as zoot suiters, for their style of clothing. Eventually, the authorities arrested and put on trial 22 young Mexican Americans. This was a precursor to what's probably more known, the Zoot Suit riots, which occurred the following summer. The trial of the Sleepy Lagoon dominated newspaper headlines for months and considerably raised racial tensions. 17 individuals were found guilty. Eventually, the ruling was overturned on appeal for denying the defendants due process, and the trial considered a miscarriage of justice. The files of the foreign language section are chock full of documents and news clippings about the Sleepy Lagoon trial. It's clear that the folks in Washington were following the events closely, and they were concerned with reports of anti-American radio broadcasts in Latin America by the Axis powers, and how that might undermine American solidarity at home. Next slide, please. As a result of the unrest and the bad press stirred up by the trial, the director of the OWI's foreign language section, Alan Cranston, a future senator from California, went to Los Angeles to meet with local leaders and officials. There are a few thick folders of documents relating to Cranston's trip, with correspondence and reports and the prior mentioned news clippings. One often cited document is this 2-page letter. Addressed to a contact at Walt Disney, it spells out on page 1 the general themes the OWI wanted to convey. For our discussion, it's the second page that is really of interest. Here, Cranston spells out 5 themes specifically for posters aimed at Mexican Americans. The themes are about unity, anti-discrimination, solidarity with Mexico, the contribution of Mexican Americans on the home front and in the Army, with a specific reference to battlefield accomplishments in Bataan. At the conclusion of his trip, Alan Cranston reported that he was satisfied with the plans the OWI had in place to address the issues that brought him to California. Next slide, please. So all of this background buildup about events in the Southwest leads us to the image we see on this slide. Here we see a bilingual poster in English and Spanish with the slogan, Americanos todos luchamos por la victoria, Americans all, let's fight for victory. The poster depicts 2 outstretched arms. One holds aloft a sombrero and the other holds an Uncle Sam style top hat with stars and stripes. Off the bat, this poster seems to have the same themes that we saw depicted earlier with the CIAA. That is, unity and solidarity between the US and Latin America standing side by side. It fits right in with what we saw earlier. However, since this is an OWI poster, we may want to think more about this. Remember, the OWI was not involved in outreach to Latin America, and unlike the CIAA posters, this one features a slogan prominently in English. By the way, Leon Alguera, the artist responsible for this poster, is an interesting character, and as we shall see, there are quite interesting and unique records relating to him at the National Archives. Next slide, please. On this page, we see 2 documents from the production reports relating to Alguera's posters, which were part of a set of 4 posters he was commissioned to work on. It appears that only the Americans All poster went to final production. The posters are referred to as the Southwestern or the Spanish American posters. From the documents, we learned that the request came from the OWI's Foreign Language Division, and the dates of the documents are from early 1943. This would be shortly after Cranston's California trip. The production sheets make clear that these posters are for a domestic audience. By the way, the production sheets are a fantastic source of information about posters. They proved so for Alguera many times over. However, I have to caution, they are hit or miss. For some posters, there is very little information, or what there is spotty. Next slide, please. Here we see two examples of original artwork by Leon Alguera for the Southwest posters. These are from the records of the OWI for original artwork for posters. While copies of many finished posters are found in the collections of other institutions, the original artwork is unique and can only be found at the National Archives. Fortunately, this set of records has been digitized and is available to view online. Here we see a draft for the Americans All poster on the left. If you compare this to the finished one, it's exactly the same, except the verb luchar has been modified. The verb tense has been modified from luchamos to luchemos. On the right, there is a sketch for one of the unrealized posters by Alguera. This one uses the theme that the Nazis are enemies of the Catholic Church, a theme that we also saw in a few of Arias Bernal's original artworks. Next slide, please. On this slide on the right, we see a letter addressed to the OWI requesting copies of the Americans All poster. It includes a mini version of the poster about the size of a baseball card. The request comes from a group called Buenos Vecinos. Buenos Vecinos is Spanish for good neighbor. This is one of those wonderful discoveries because it provides insight into how this poster was used and by whom. In this case, informing us that the club is made up of Americans and Latin Americans of various nationalities who get together at the Army-Navy Club in San Francisco, California. On the left of this, the response, and in good customer service fashion, we learned that they are all out, the OWI is all out of posters, with one exception, which they are able to enclose and return to sender. Next slide, please. Now for something a little different. Leon Alguera produced other art for the OWI, including the images on the left. Here we see Uncle Sam hushing the viewer. This logo appeared on a nationwide hush campaign known as the Security of War Information Campaign. It appeared on OWI posters, but also in many other forms, including car stickers, pamphlets, and newspaper and magazine ads. It was printed millions of times over. In the center, we have a handwritten letter by Alguera about the logo addressed to President Roosevelt in regard to the likeness of Uncle Sam to FDR, which is a great story in itself. But on this document, I want to direct your attention to a couple of interesting things related to our topic. At the top, we see that the letterhead is for Los Panamericanos de Nueva York. This was a social club that Alguera was president of in New York City. Its mission was to promote friendship and unity between North and South Americans, similar to the Buenos Vecinos Club we just saw out of San Francisco. Below this, Alguera takes credit for the first portrait, not caricature, of Uncle Sam made by a Mexican artist. You may recall that Arias Bernal made cartoons of Uncle Sam. This sure sounds like a rivalry of sorts, doesn't it? Finally, near the bottom, we see another reference to FDR's good neighbor policy. Leon Alguera was a reliable designer for the OWI, and there is additional correspondence from him in the files. In the letters, he comes through as an enthusiastic promoter of Mexican-American relations, and you can see more of his domestic posters in the National Archives catalog. This brings us to the end with Alguera, and now we will take a look at one final OWI artist and artwork. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have an original poster designed by artist Javier Gonzalez. It features a GI flanked by the Virgin of Guadalupe and a Spanish mission. Gonzalez was born in Spain, raised in Mexico, and then studied and settled in the US, where he lived for the rest of his life. This image is another design for the OWI's Southwest campaign. From the notes on the edges of the illustration, which are transcribed to the right of the image, it is clear that this is intended for a domestic audience. The comments mention creating an American Southwestern scene and making the face of the figure more Mexican American. Similar comments were also made about Alguera's work. There is no confirmation that this design ever became a finished poster. It's possible the OWI was shopping around and decided that the Americans All poster was all they wanted for the Southwest campaign. You can find additional World War II posters by Gonzalez in the online National Archives catalog. He also designed post office murals in the 1930s in Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama, as did his wife, Ethel Edwards, an accomplished artist in her own right. You can find documents related to both of them in the records of the Public Works Administration at NARA, and there is also further information for both of them in other institutions, such as the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, where they donated their papers. And with this, we have come to the end of our topical section. To sum up, we've seen artwork intended to win over Latin Americans abroad and Hispanic Americans here at home. Learning the stories behind the images provides a window back in time and places the posters within the larger events of history. They also help round out the biographies of the artists. Some of these are stories that only NARA records can tell. Next slide, please. We will now pivot to our last section, in which I will briefly discuss some tips and tricks for those who might be interested in doing your own research into posters. Next slide, please. So, as the title says, begin with the small print. If you're starting with a poster, check for an artist's signature, a slogan, and then usually at the very bottom, the name of the publisher or agency. Lastly, check the language. This poster, we saw this poster earlier among the CIAA Spanish posters, but here we see the Portuguese version. This poster is titled, "We Fight for the Liberty of All" by E. McKnight Coffer. If you want to discover World War II posters yourself, you can go to NARA's online catalog and search using the terms 44-PA, 44-PF, or 208-AOP. Here you will be able to browse thousands of posters, or simply search using the term World War II posters and filter for the entries that you want. One of the wonderful things about the online catalog is that it has thousands of posters to view. Next slide, please. The good news is that the textual records, regarding the CIAA and the OWI, the good news is that the textual records are well organized and fairly easy to navigate, especially by offices within each agency. And this is especially important if you're doing poster research, because you'll want to zoom in on the graphics department and the arts department and so forth. Once you've settled on a poster or other search criteria, that should narrow the field to which record group to search within. Once you have your record group, you can browse either the PDF inventory, which is especially nice for seeing the hierarchy of an agency broken down by office. You should also search within the National Archives catalog online using appropriate search terms. This will return results for folder titles, among other things. Even though their information overlaps, I like to do a combination of both the PDFs and the catalog. If your search leads you to the OWI records, I strongly recommend looking at the production reports. It proved an especially rich source for Leon Alguera's work. We have an index in the works for this entry. that was worked on last summer by a summer intern, and we are very appreciative of that. One last tip for this slide, don't neglect miscellaneous files. If you go back over the citations for this presentation, you will see that some of our relevant documents reside in folders titled miscellaneous. You may be pleasantly surprised by what you find there. I should stress that the National Archives did not label these folders miscellaneous. They were probably labeled miscellaneous by the agencies over 75 years ago before they came to the National Archives. And that's the name the folders are still known as. But often, if it's a miscellaneous file that belongs to the art department or the graphics department, and you're already looking in those records, you should also not neglect to look in the miscellaneous file. After all of this, if you've hit a dead end, then it's time to think more broadly and expand your search criteria. Next slide, please. So this slide could also be labeled or titled, Think Outside the Record Group. Starting from clockwise from the lower left, consider searching outside your record group in other record groups. We learned about Arias Bernal, for example, not from the records of the CIAA, who commissioned him to make posters, but from the records of the US Embassy in Mexico, which is record group 84. And Frida Everett's letter about CIAA posters was actually found in the records of the OWI. In addition, Leon Alguera's letter to President Roosevelt resides at the FDR Library. Next is the presidential libraries. The presidential libraries also have poster collections of their own. And of course, FDR and Truman were the wartime presidents, and their libraries will have records relating to the agencies of the period. Outside of the National Archives, there are other institutions that may have relevant or related material. We'll see an example of this on the next slide. And before that, you can also consider Ancestry.com. It's useful for searching artists by name, and searching historical newspaper databases will help with finding additional information. Ancestry.com and historical newspapers are both available for free for researchers at NARA facilities when the facilities are open. Next slide, please. At the top of this slide, the acronyms stand for the Museum of Modern Art, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian Institution. And here is an example. This is a CIAA poster which won a competition organized by MoMA. The small type at the bottom of the poster identifies it as the winner in Spanish. The links will take you to the links on this page will take you to the MoMA documents about this poster and the other winning entries in the poster competition. Next slide, please. If you want further information about the artists and posters today, you can read my blog posts about Arias Bernal and Leon Alguera, which are found at the text message blog. Included in the post are more documents and links, citations, and bibliographies. Next slide, please. And here are a few recommendations if you want even more information. The Tango War by Mary Jo McConaughey is a great read about Latin American relations at the time. The American History Tellers podcast gives an overview of what was going on at home, on the home front during the war. And to see more World War II posters, the FDR Library has a great online exhibit. The Americans All poster by Alguera makes an appearance in all three of these resources. Also, right now, there is an exhibit at the Herbert Hoover Library and Museum, Viva Hoover, about Hoover's goodwill tour to Latin America. You should check that out online and also to find out if and when they will be open for in-person viewing. Next slide, please. This brings us to the end. I want to thank my many NARA colleagues who provided help as I researched into these posters, and my supervisors, past and present, who allowed me time to work on this project. Finally, I want to say thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. Thank you for your interest and for taking the time to be with us today. And with that, I think we have time for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel. So appreciate all of the resources that you provided. We do have some questions that came on through the chat. So you might have covered most of this, but let's go through them all. The question is, what is the copyright status of the posters, and what's the most efficient way to get a high-resolution scan or copy?
I would say, so I'm speaking about the posters as an archivist in the Textual Records branch. So I can speak about the paper documents. I can't speak so much directly to the posters. If you do want to, the posters were commissioned by the US government and they are in the public domain. But if you want any further information about reproductions or copyright, I would suggest you contact the Still Pictures branch at the National Archives in College Park. They are the custodial unit responsible for these posters.
Thank you, and we'll provide a link to their email shortly. Thanks. So if anybody has any questions, please submit them into the chat section here on YouTube. So we have some more questions for you. The next question is, did the agencies only hire Latino artists to make these posters?
That's a great question. No, they did not. I highlighted the Latino artists for this talk today. For the most part, the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, their focus was on Latin America, but most of their work, but the poster artists they hired were primarily American. The OWI made posters for everywhere in the world except Latin America, and they hired artists of every background you can think of who reside in America. And conversely, the OWI, the Office of War Information, they're the ones who commissioned Leon Alguera and Javier Gonzalez to make Spanish language posters, but they also commissioned them to make general domestic posters. So that's why, without regard to Latin American or Latino, a Latino or Hispanic audience. So for example, Leon Alguera made posters about Uncle Sam for a hush campaign. And Javier Gonzalez made war bonds posters, which were for the general public. That's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. I thought so too. So you talked a lot about the artists being commissioned to do this work. So our next question is, were all of these artists contracted by the federal government, or were they employees of the agencies?
So I'm not, the artists that I highlighted today were all on contract. They were commissioned for individual projects. The OWI, for example, had thousands of artists and made thousands of posters, but they did not have a staff that large. Even though they did have a large staff, it wasn't large enough to employ 1,000 artists full-time. They did have art departments who were responsible for the coordinating of the posters. At the OWI, there were a few artists on staff who did make posters, but they were also involved in other aspects of running the OWI. Most famous, I think, or most well-known, maybe the artist Ben Chun, who worked for the OWI as well as was commissioned to make posters for the OWI.
Okay, interesting that there are federal employees involved in this effort. Okay, so our next question, you may or may not know because it's about the Mexican archives. The question is, are there records about these events or individuals in Mexican archives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's true that I don't really know. I have searched for Arias Bernal online, and there are photos of him at the INAH. I believe that's the National Institute for Anthropology and History. And I would like to think, so both Arias Bernal and Leon Alguera lived out their days in Mexico. Leon Alguera lived in the United States for over 35 years, but I think he retired to Mexico and he continued to work there. So I think one would have more luck finding out more personal material about them, and maybe if they have papers, searching in Mexico. I have discovered on Facebook, there is an Arias Bernal museum. I think it only exists on Facebook, but that's as far as I know about Mexican collections. But it's worthwhile. I think there's great potential there to find out more about these two individuals to round out their biographies. Like Alfonso Ontiveros, I don't know anything about him besides his first name and that he's a Mexican artist. So that would be a wonderful discovery if someone could find out more about him. And Javier Gonzalez was only in Mexico for a few years during childhood. And he donated his papers to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, which is in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much. I'm impressed with the amount of background knowledge that you collected beyond the records we have at the National Archives.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's really helpful it complements the information.
Absolutely. Context is everything. A few more questions that actually have come in from our staff. Next one is, was the change in artist style ordered by the CIAA, or was it part of the artist's vision for this project?
I don't know exactly about a change in style. There is Arias Bernal Antonio Arias Bernal usually made cartoons, or that's what he's known for. And he has that one poster of the colossal sentry, which which looks different from all of his other posters. I don't know if he came up with that on his own or not. I do know that the documents, that 25-page document from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, from the records of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, makes very clear that the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs dictates the themes and will also have sort of final say about the posters. Some of the posters that Arias Bernal made look very similar to the magazine covers he had previously done. So he did recycle some of his cartoon characters and some of his material. But obviously the bureaucrats, the art departments at the CIAA and the OWI had the final say. And we do see a little bit of that with the what I call the rejected posters, or the posters that never that were never made into finished posters. We do see there's sort of critiques of them, whether they're saying the face is not Mexican American enough, or the color isn't bright enough. And a lot of that, there's more of that, especially in the production reports. That's why those are really a wonderful source. I do have to caution, besides being spotty, sometimes you look for a poster and you won't find it, or sometimes you find it and they don't have a lot of information. They are also handwritten in pencil, and it looks like someone wrote it very quickly. So sometimes, even if you do find something, you have to look very closely to be able to comprehend what you're reading.
Oh, great tips. Thank you. So Speaking about historical context, our next question is, were these propaganda programs in any way a response to Japanese internment, a way to ally fears of citizens harboring foreign allegiance?
I don't know if they were, I think they were separate. I don't think they had, I don't think the people commissioning these posters were connecting these to the incarceration of Japanese Americans at the time. I think what I tried to point out in this talk is that they were being very, the OWI and Alan Cranston were being very responsive to the events in Los Angeles with the murder of Jose Diaz, the Sleepy Lagoon murder. So I think they were directly responding to that, trying to ease the racial tensions at the time, without. I think it's unconnected to what was happening to Japanese Americans at the time.
Okay.
But it is a fascinating juxtaposition that, on one hand, it seems a very enlightened move on the part of the OWI to make a poster called "Americans All," which indicated it meant Americans of all backgrounds or one people, and there is a dissonance between what the OWI is doing, at least in regard to the Sleepy Lagoon murder, when you think of the fact that Japanese Americans were being incarcerated at the same time.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think we only have one more question left, and it is, are there programs that exist today to drive foreign relations through art?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm stuck in the 1940s. I'm not sure about that. Perhaps the USIA, if they're still, depending on how active they are, I'm not sure. This was a sort of, what was going on, especially the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, was very unique. One of the scholars who writes about it, Darlene Sadlier, refers to it as the height of American cultural diplomacy. I mean, the fact that a U.S. government agency was very active in creating artistic exchanges and cultural exchanges really stands out. And from what I've recently heard was that this actually slowed down during the presidency of JFK. So looking at the events of the 1940s it's actually a very unique time for American cultural diplomacy.
That's so fascinating. Thank you so much. I do not see any more questions. So I'm going to bring myself back up. And so, Daniel, thank you very much. And thank you for being our guinea pig for our first presentation since March. So to the audience, if we did not get to your question, or if you have one later, please submit it to archives2reference@nara.gov. Please know that the presentation video recording and handouts will remain available on this YouTube webpage. Lastly, we value your opinion, so please take a minute to complete a short evaluation. Your comments help us maintain quality of our services and plan future programs. Find the evaluation link under Show More. On behalf of the National Archives, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in to watch.
Have a great evening.